All right. So today, in this more empty class than usual, it looks like, we will be talking about globalization and the transformation of political community. So political community mostly, and then we will also be talking about the world order and concluding this book. So these are the last two chapters of this book. You don't have to worry about it anymore, save for the final exam. When that is, we figure that out. So that's what we're doing today. Next week we begin reading Are We Rome? Hopefully you have it by now. First chapter is just read the prelude, introduction chapter, whatever that is, and then we will be talking about that. We'll probably have a kind of shift in the way class is laid out. I'll still be lecturing a lot about it, but I also want you guys to, underline things, bring things you'd like to talk about, because I want to kind of run this in a marginal seminar style where we discuss the book together and we say, well, I think this was a bad point, or I think this was a good point. So that is what's on tap for last month, essentially, since next week is November. Crazy enough, that's happened already. And then I think there's homework due Tuesday. I believe so. Yes, there is. For that homework, when we start doing this book, what I want you to do for this is to pick out a paragraph, a couple of lines, 3 or 4 lines that makes a point that you agree or disagree with, and then in 2 paragraphs, just say why you agree, disagree with this point, why was it a valid point, yada yada. Essentially, what you've been doing with the homework, just applied to you picked out something from the book to talk about. So that's what we're doing.
From the chapter that you're
From the chapter that we're doing that day in class, just like the homework is usually. It's for what we're discussing that day of class. As you notice, I am taping class today and probably will be taping class on Tuesday as well because I'll be changing teaching style somewhat. This is from my supervisor, Dr. Kenneth Howarth, who is a wonderful, great man, for my evaluation on how my teaching is doing. And so, just keep that in mind. You just act naturally because it's just videotapes. So let's get started. Introduction. What is political community? There's many types of political communities. You have your local political community. Think of that perhaps as maybe your local religious group, maybe your local ethnic group. These things, that's local. You have associations. That's maybe a broader group such as your overall religion. Then you have, and that's also your state as well. You have political communities such as NGOs where like-minded people come together to push policy agenda regarding things like amnesty, these things, and then you have virtual communities, something that's opened up in the globalized digital era to where you can now identify with people all around the world and discuss and come together behind interests and commonalities virtually, which offers a very great possibility in community. Each of these types of political communities have distinctive patterns of cooperation. How you cooperate with your virtual community is going to be much different than how you cooperate with your fellow community members in, say, the state. They each have different goals and what they're trying to get accomplished. So just know that types of political communities each have different aspects, different types of cooperation, and different types of goals in mind. Also, politics exist in all communities, no matter the size, the scope, how varied it is. All people have politics. Just think of your family unit. That's technically a kind of community. And think of the political things that go on with your parents, your brothers, your extended family. Politics exists everywhere. It just depends on how you look at it. So just all communities possess some form of politics. Now, what leads to our rise in, say, nationalistic states and all of the states around the world is this enthusiasm for self-rule or to be free from domination of others. This is what gets a community going to a political community going towards their own sovereign rights, their own hopes of pursuing political autonomy. There's just an enthusiasm for self-rule and to be free from others dominating them. Of course, within communities, there's these aspects of loyalty and self-sacrifice. Think about your state and how in past times it was a glorious thing to die for your state, that it still kind of is. Think about how much we uplift our armed fighters around the world. We're proud of our troops. We still hold up this idea of loyalty and self-sacrifice to be very quintessential to being part of the greater political community. And we can also belong to multiple communities. It's not just, I'm American and nothing else. You could also be, I'm Irish. That's my ancestral ethnic heritage, and I'm also American. I'm Irish American, and I'm also Christian. I'm also Muslim. All of these things are different political communities that sometimes actually have competing interests with each other, but we'll talk about navigating and these interests later. And now with globalization, we know that power politics with political communities is changing a little bit. It's not just about the state compelling people to identify one way or another. Now, national movements within states, such as all of the different nationalistic ethnic movements in Africa, Southeast Asia, Eurasia, these places, really trying to exert themselves and become actual states. So power politics just isn't your centralized state beating down people anymore to accomplish goals and to deliver one type of community. So nationalism and political community. Early forms of political communities vary from the nation state we exist in today. Citizenship was much more restricted. It was usually land-owning males that were in the military, and these people could vote, but even still then, these people were part of probably the power elite in terms of the military, and the military is what mostly controlled your politics in your local political community. From there, we also have things like empires, which, like the Roman Empire, very, very spread out, but not really strongly controlling all of the people in it, like we can now with the way, we'll talk about that in a second, our powers, the extensive power of a state, to where we can really penetrate deep within the state to try and pinpoint, control, guide people's lives in one direction or another. Old forms of political community had much more looser association. There was far less citizenship, but in a sense, people had a little bit more free reign because the state wasn't determining more aspects of their lives. So then, following these early forms of political community, we rise to the territorial state. This is around, the medieval ages. We're working towards the Westphalian system of states. So we now see states becoming much more up. You have your person at the top, monarch, probably really influencing policy down, really trying to dictate the rule of the people in their kingdom, in their state. So there's more power to control society. You have more social regulations, you have more just regulation in general. But we also see that territorial states are becoming more and more interconnected with each other, with spread out types of political communities everywhere, and we start complicating things. Territorial states were now moving towards the modern states, what we're in now, when capitalism and national media form. These are two of the three quintessential ways that a state forms a national identity and forms a national political community. Capitalism, because we now have ubiquitous consumer products, we have industrialization where people are going to work in specific industries, and it's becoming pretty much uniform around the area. We see capitalism really brings the state together in the terms of economics, while the media allows us to form this imagined community. Prior to lots of mass media, think about America pre-Civil War, and how we were, I believe, watching, I think it was the John Green video on nationalism, where we referred to America as these United States, not the United States. Mass media, our national media, allows us to understand what it's like to be in different parts of the country. It gives us a perception of it. Before we had mass media, we couldn't necessarily imagine what it was like to live in Tennessee if you were from New York, or what it was like to live on the Western territories compared to maybe Virginia. With national media, we now start getting national stories, national fiction about these different areas, so we can understand, well, that's what it's like to live in Tennessee. Okay, well, you can empathize a little bit more, you can understand it more, while also mass media giving us topics we can talk about, unifying us around news, around fiction, around things we all now have common interest in talking about. This helps form a national identity. War is also our third that is very important in terms of creating national identity. We'll talk about it in a couple of slides about othering communities, but around war, we can really rally behind. When we get into a deep war, such as World War II, we can rally behind an identity of what we want our country. We're Americans as opposed to Nazis. We're Americans as opposed to Imperial Japan or fascist Italy. We have these values, and we come behind these values that make us American. War allows us to kind of create that rhetoric of what it means to be American while projecting an enemy that is not American. And then we see the spread of nationalism. The third world, seeing how Europe was able to really come to power behind nationalistic ideas, says, well, you know, we need this nationalism as well because it's going to help us form communities, it's help us form power. So we can see that in an attempt to replicate the success of Europe in creating a state, nationalism spreads to the third world and leads to the many different conflicts that now engulf parts of Africa and Southeast Asia and South America. Community and citizenship. The rise of the industrial class challenges absolute monarchy. So prior to around the 1600s, rights were very, very suppressed, of course. You had kings wielding absolute power, and then their vassals, their knights, these people, their political friends, having most of the power. Well, when we start getting industrialization, we see the rise of a working class, we see the rise mostly of an industrial trading class, who now have economic power, saying, King, we deserve the right to vote, we deserve the right to be represented, we deserve parts of your power. This challenge, of course, eventually ends in our absolute monarchy. It ends it with the various revolutions, the French Revolution, the Orange Revolution in England. So we start seeing expanded rights. As these expanded rights, as time progresses, more and more people start asking for more rights. It shouldn't just be white, land-owning, rich men who have the right to vote. So in time, women get the right to vote, then minorities, with soon an expansive suffrage class that can actually vote. After this, now we're starting to see the beginning of the rise of welfare rights, such as the right to good health, the rise to political institutions that actually meet needs and can make sure the society sustains itself and it's just not the rich benefiting with the poor bottoming out. And as well with massive amounts of new civic rights. Think about the 60s with the expansive rights of how not to be treated in custody of the police, protest rights. We see that there's kind of a progression to these things. It's a deepening of citizenship. It means much more to be a citizen of a political community than it used to. That now you have the right to be treated fairly before your peers in a court of law. You have the right to vote. You have the right to good health. You have the right to your society benefiting you somewhat. Some theorists would argue that the upper classes, your upper white class citizens, knowing that, like, oh well, we can preserve the social order if we just keep handing out more and more citizens' rights to people. There's going to be less attention, and this leads to this idea of the end of ideology. In the 50s and 60s, political theorists began theorizing, like, oh well, we see that all of these peoples are starting to actually get rights, and this is going to, in fact, stop political contention. It's going to, make people more calm. Society's going to run well, and we're not going to fight with each other because everyone has rights and has the right to vote. We'll talk about that with all of its major problems in a second. But this idea of the deepening of the end of ideology and deepening citizenship, and the way this historically leads to modernization theory, which is theorists once again postulating that, oh well, if the third world just follows the flow and the ebb of how the West succeeded in stamping out all of its conflict socially, oh well, they just need to follow this path and they'll be great, stable industrial states soon enough. That's modernization theory. All of this has a lot of problems. If we remember the 50s and 60s, there was still a whole lot of social conflict, because while maybe the upper class was giving out more rights, not in a deep way. They were like, oh, you can vote, but we're going to find a lot of ways to also make you not vote. We're also going to hold you down economically. We're also going to make sure we suppress you as much as possible. So you have more citizenship, I promise. So that's a problem, because that's only superficial rhetoric. It didn't actually mean anything. And then modernization theory is very much, as we've talked about many times before, kind of Western imperialism, where if just the third world adopts the ideology and the institutions of the West, they'll be fine. That doesn't lead to, this wasn't nearly as clean cut as theorists would like to make it who believe in this. It was a hellacious time of conflict and war that actually led to these things, and lo and behold, the third world also faces these problems because they're trying to catch up after hundreds of years of Europe's own mess and progress, and they're going through it as well. So political community, of course, is changing. Globalization of political and economic life has increased. So we're saying with global political life and economic life interconnected more, we see that communities around the world can talk to each other. Our economies are becoming far more integrated, just the normal process of globalization, but fragmentation, has increased. We're starting to see a lot more splits in what a nation means. Think about many of the nations in Europe who now fear the growing Islamic presence in those countries. Same as here, where we fear incoming people from both the Islamic world and the Latin world. Fragmentation culturally is happening. There's not just this steady monolithic idea of what it means to be, say, in the American political community. So this creates an interesting tension. It's most pronounced in third world countries, especially quasi and failed states. Think about all of the ethnic conflict, all of the religious war that goes on in the third world. This is in part from nationalism, and it's of course in part from the European colonial powers pulling out from Africa and all of their former colonial states, and just redrawing lines willy-nilly, like, oh, that seems right, this country should look that way. This causes a lot of fragmentations. Tribes aren't necessarily entitled to their homeland anymore. Different people are broken up, so it causes a lot of different peoples wanting political autonomy, more political rights, and losing what it means to be, say, one core political community. Of course, it's pronounced in quasi and failed states. Of course, as we talked about, I think it was Tuesday, with intervention, there was a time in the 90s where we went into countries, we intervened to try and ease these things, to try and help make political community more sensible and stop the attacks on each other's political communities. And it works. It kind of works, as we talked about, and it eventually leads to the establishment of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, where we're prosecuting people who have really committed war crimes, genocide, these things. So we see that we're trying to enforce political community, but it's still very fragmented. What are we talking about? Globalization. So, with globalization, we see a much more larger amount of fragmentation and diversification. Peoples around the world are seeing that, oh, I have like-minded people here, maybe not in my own country, but they exist elsewhere. Access to the web, access to better communication styles allows people to see what communities look like, and allows them to form their own political movements, their own political communities in their own areas, because they can actually get connected with people they might not be able to otherwise without the web. And of course, the politics of multiculturalism. This was a big political point in the 90s on the fear that we were starting to lose national identity to these multiculturalists. We start seeing more policies trying to enforce what it means to be American, what it means to be British. So while also a lot of rhetoric that we need to be tolerant, we need to be accepting of people. So political community post the Cold War becomes this very tense moment in trying to decide how best to solidify our own national identity. So we're actually one people, we can rally behind one thing while also accepting difference, being tolerant of other people's cultures, and it forms essentially a battle. All the cultural battles we go through now that we still talk about. And then finally, when we think about the changing nature of political community, we have to think about what long-standing peace does to it. A lot of times, as we talked about, war is a big motivator to actually forming national community, national political community. It helps us rally behind one image. It gets us on board with things. It allows us to come together and rally behind something. So peace, a very long-term peace, demystifies us a little bit. When's the last time we actually had to rally behind what it means to be American and go to war with someone? 9/11 and the war on terror, yes, a little bit, but before then, we had a long-standing period of peace, in a sense. So diversification could happen. People could start making their own identities. They could actually branch out and find people. This leads to all of your national movements, all of the new people saying, well, we're a group, we deserve our political autonomy, we deserve actual more political rights. Think about Native Americans now finally not being sidelined by, well, they're still somewhat sidelined, but they're allowed to come together more because of the internet, because of us not trying to wait to pigeonhole Native Americans. They can actually try and come together and hopefully maybe change things like discriminating names of sports teams that, the Redskins controversy essentially, where, it's offensive. And Native American groups aren't happy with it, so now we can actually talk about that. And it's not like, oh, no, that's DC. You can't talk about DC. That's our nation. So there's just this, in a long-standing peace, we can start trying to make gains towards trying to destroy images and rhetoric that are inherently racist and offensive, but this also affects that we don't have a national identity as well. So, moving on. Group rights. So now, as I said with Native Americans, we're in this moment in time where groups are trying to affirm the need to recognize their difference. It's not just about, well, yeah, we're American, but we're also Native American. We have our own culture, a history of injustice against us. We deserve political rights. We deserve some sort of political difference instead of just horrible conditions that you've been treating us to. We deserve actual political consideration. This leads to us wondering about community and difference. If we're so different from each other, say between Native Americans, Black America, White America, of course Hispanic America, how do we form a community? So this becomes kind of troublesome to more conservative theorists, more conservative ideologues who think that all of this difference is just essentially trying to rip us apart. It's making us weaker. We need to rally behind what it means to be American. Always remember when we think about this rhetoric that there's this true Americanness, that it's heavily influenced by white upper middle class people, what it means for them to have the American dream. So you have to worry about what does it actually mean to be American when it's so greatly influenced by one specific group. Of course, feminism is always a good critiquer of these things. Feminism wants us to challenge the gendered construction of national identity and community. Well, we've seen that war is a very heavily influential aspect of how we determine our national identity. As we talked about with feminism when we talked about it, war is a very masculine, gendered construction. And the way it influences, the way it needs strength, uncaring, remorselessness, these attributes that aren't necessarily considered positive for trying to create community, we need to actually try and strip that away. We need to look at new ways to construct national identity and be wary of the way that patriarchy actually influences how we actually understand community. But of course, with this, there's always the critical point of, well, these are Western white feminists and how they're trying to criticize patriarchy. It needs to be handled differently all over the world. It's just, once again, another form of Western imperialism that, oh, women in the third world, you need to also respond the same way to patriarchy as we do. We need to be wary of that. We should allow for different groups to associate with... One second. These different groups should be allowed to fight against these powers that are oppressing them in ways that are best for their own culture and not just have to subscribe to the way Western feminism would do it. And of course, one last way to try and preserve your national identity is through traditional values. In the face of all of this all of the multiculturalism, all of the fragmentation, many conservative religious groups are saying that no, this is not what our nation is supposed to be. We need to go back to the idealized past of, this is when tradition was strong, and that the nuclear family was strong, and that
Norman Rockefeller.
Yeah, 50s America, what it was like to actually join, go out to the suburbs, have a car, a couple kids, these very nostalgic things, and even more than that, with radical Islam or radical Christianity, going back to the Bible days, and that you actually need to make sure that culture is preserved through preserving those traditional values. There's a lot of different ways that people go about trying to form political communities, and this is what we see with this. Which leads us to wonder, we've been talking about our own political community mostly. What it means to be American, what it means to be a black American, what it means to be a white American. These are our own groups, essentially in state. What are our other obligations to other groups, though? Say, Sudanese people, people in Somalia, people in Japan, people in China. What are our obligations to them? They are very distinctly different political community. We don't even necessarily share religion with them or culture with them. What are our obligations to them? So that's a question we have to always ask ourselves. In a world today, we're starting to see that there aren't simple problems that one political community can handle. We have global problems, such as climate change and global poverty. The economic system is strong everywhere. It's not just one nation. It affects most nations now, if not every nation. And this leads us to wonder, what should we do to save strangers? These people that live so far away, we hear about the suffering they go through, we hear about their poverty, their hunger, but they're still strangers. We don't connect with them per se. They're still foreign, we don't know their language. We can only so much empathize with them. So as we remember, we're talking about international ethics with people such as Peter Singer. Well, that doesn't mean anything. We're all moral, equal individuals in the world, so we should have this moral obligation, this moral duty to help them. And this is aided especially by the idea of a global civil society, that we're now living in an era where we're so interconnected with people, we're so interconnected all around the world, we can actually help people more. We're unified more, where there's not just boundaries, we can transcend territorial boundaries. There are skeptics to this, of course. There's always skeptics. They think that, no, there's not a global civil society. Look at Rwanda in 1994. Look at Somalia. Look at most nations now. We pick and choose who we want to be connected to. And it mostly depends on the media cycle. It depends on our interest in those nations. It's essentially a very cynical point of view, but somewhat correct too, that we talk about this global civil society, but we're still very picky and choosy and see you later kind of things, where we help people one day and then forget about them the next day. Think about the massive outpouring to Haiti following the earthquake. Everyone sent $10 text messaging, and then, well, that's it. Sean Penn's there. He'll help them. And that's kind of the end of it. And the skeptics make a very strong point with this, that we're not as invested in this as the rhetoric would say we are. But we still have the theorists out there, and remember we've talked about this before, such as cosmopolitan democracy, that we're actually at a point where we can somewhat form a global democracy, where we have all of these institutions that are helping regulate and help funnel globalization one way or another. We all are citizens of the world. We have world citizenship. We're all equal human beings, and because of this, we should help each other without any thinking about it, that we're all the same. Just as we should help people in Trenton, we should help people all the way in South Africa, all the way in the islands of the South Pacific. We're all moral equals, so we should help each other. And we have global markets. We have democratization. These things are all growing now. So it's leading, hopefully, towards this cosmopolitan democracy. I mean, the global market is everywhere. Democracy is flourishing, it looks like. These are all things that theorists are pointing to say that we're entering an age of hopefully some form of global governance, to where we aren't so worried about the borders, we have. Is this utopian? Yes. This is very utopian. Boundaries still matter. As the skeptics have already pointed out, we are only so concerned with certain people around the world, and then we stop being concerned with them. So while this is wonderful, beautiful thinking, and it makes us hope for a better tomorrow, we're not there, and it's a very utopian way to look at things. But we have another school of thought who are like, no, we still have all of these layers. We can do something with this. These are the neo-medievalists. Just like in medieval times when you had, if we think about the way medieval society was set up, you had your feudal land where, serfs worked to a knight so that was one form of political autonomy. That was then kind of, associated with the king who could kind of direct things going there. And then you had like the Vatican, or you had the Caliphate for the Islamic community. There was these overlapping authorities, and we existed in that. Neo-medievalists point towards the EU as a way to think about this. That, okay, you have your state, you have, your areas in that state, and people are under those, and then you have the EU who also makes policy. So we kind of have this medieval structure already set up, so this seems to be working some. I think we'll talk about the challenges to that on the next slide, but we'll get there. So the challenges of global interconnectedness. So we've seen that people being more interconnected with each other, they're more likely to find like-minded individuals who they think share their culture, their ethnic background, and just their political aims, essentially. Well, this has caused a lot of chaos, too. It's caused the destruction of many centralized states like the USSR. This idea of global connectedness and, nationalistic community dissolved the USSR following the end of the Cold War. Completely took apart most of the former Soviet states. Yugoslavia and Indonesia also fell into this when communities within those states wanted power, wanted their own authority, and Yugoslavia broke apart and Indonesia entered civil war. That's the word I'm thinking of. So realists then advise against thinking that peace amongst developed nations will last. They still see all of these conflicts worldwide about nationalistic pride, whose political community should be recognized. The peace that we have right now is a little bit unstable then. It's not founded on legs that will stand forever. All it takes is one state thinking that they should rise above everyone else, throwing the world back into chaos and war. These realists would also argue that recognizing this amount of multiculturalism, recognizing all of these different political communities, is essentially a pathway to violent conflict because it weakens state power. They see that, okay, well, we're here, and mine's gone for a second. With all of these states, with all of these communities wanting political autonomy within their own state, it weakens the state because you're losing one nationalistic image, you're breaking apart the boundaries, you're just causing conflict internally. And realists and neolists say people look to the state for security. That's what they don't look for their ethnic group. They look for a state to secure them. But we have to wonder, can we still look at alternative forms of political community even if we look for the state security? And the answer is yes. You can do that. Of course, the high levels of interconnectedness expose societies to forces they cannot control necessarily. Think about the EU with all of its borders opening, with how connected it is. It allows terror groups, more radical people to easily move through borders without being known, per se. And same around the world. This interconnectedness exposes societies to more threats. Our global institutions, of course, hopefully stymie this a little bit with how we regulate trade, how we regulate things, but there's only so much you can do. Of course, interconnectedness changes the states. It coordinated at the global levels alters power politics. States now cannot just think singularly with their own national interests, with their own state interest. They have to adapt their interests to meet other states' interests because of how interconnected we are. China, of course, would like to keep burning carbon to fuel their industrialism, but they have to throttle it back a little bit because we all want to be on Earth in 100 years and not be underwater. That would be really helpful to all the states. So states have to balance that interest. So this interconnectedness leads to states rethinking their power politics and their own national interest. Then we start looking at our IR theorists and what they have to say about these things. Communitarians stress the value people place on belonging to a particular community, and they think that's good, that we should we should want to be a part of one group. And we should want to be that way, because that's good, it's intrinsic, it helps people build up lives, it helps them build culture, it makes them feel good, it gives them security. These are all positive things for an individual. And it links citizenship with your nation state, that, we're American, that's what we are. That's who you belong to, that's who you are a citizen of, that's a good community to be a part of. And same with everyone else around the world in their own community. We should have that because communities help people in different forms than other, but precise communities. Post-structuralists, of course, always looking to be critical of things, argue that there'll be new forms of power and domination in the way we set up political communities interconnected with each other. We should always be wary of things that are universal, because as we know, with power and domination from our rhetoric, there aren't universal things, there aren't universal rights, there are rights that are constructed by white liberals or, the West. And that makes a difference to your rights all around the world if you don't agree with them. And of course, as we talked about with scare quote humanitarian interventions, that humanitarian interventions sometimes are basically ploys for states to go in and run new states. Of course, we talked about Jacques Derrida all the way back in political theory. He makes a strong point on neo-medievalism, that reconstituting our medieval political structure is just going to essentially reinforce an outside-inside distinction, especially with Islam. It's like, no, he's basically saying that the EU is the Europeans, and that's who we are, that's who our community is, and we're contrasting that with the Islamic world, so it creates conflict between what it means to be European and what it means to be Islamic. And it's just reformulating that distinction. Post-structuralists, of course, argue that communitarians aren't always off the boat here. They also need to be criticized. These are criticizing your utopian ideas, but post-structuralists say, no, we need to look at communitarians too. And they're basically saying that to make your ideal nation, you also have to marginalize something. That's when we reflect on community, it means creating the other. To be American means you are specifically not Chinese. You are not Japanese. You are not African. These are when you create a community, you have to other someone. Someone has to be the difference that makes your values unique. So that's important, that we should always reflect on when we think about community, is that even in your own community, you have to understand that for your community to be unique, it has to not be something else. And of course, within the global age, we have such a proliferation of information that people can formulate political movements, such as maybe Occupy, the Arab Spring, and really try and get their own political communities on the top. So globalization allows things like that to happen. Conclusion. IR has been largely understanding relations between different political communities. That's essentially what international relations are, is that we're understanding what led, America and Germany to go to war. That's the difference in political community, the American political community versus the Nazi German political community. That's what IR is. And of course, realists and Eurorealists are going to constantly argue community worldwide is unlikely because national interest is important, state interest comes first. How can you develop a worldwide community when each individual state is putting their own self-interest before any sort of global interest? The sovereign state, of course, is not going to be replaced, but globalization alters our conversation around it. Our sovereign state is still our base political community. It's your nation. It's America. It's the UK. But globalization changes how we think about that. It changes how borders become more blurry, and how we need to start seeing that American culture, of course, spills all over the world, and how also we're then influenced by cultures around the world and communities around the world. And what the future of political community looks like, of course, depends on the conversations we are having now. What's going on in this classroom today? What's going on when you talk to people about this, if you do? These are changing how we think about political community. If you're a person who sees the African, the South Pacific Islander as a moral equal, well, that brings them more into your community. It leads us to a global community. But if you're a person who sees the danger of the Latin world coming into America or the Islamic world coming into America, that also determines on how you see political community. So it just depends on how we're talking. And that is our talk on political community. Does anyone have any questions on anything so far? Huh? Well, the sky is blue because of light refraction, of course. So, of course, as always, if you have questions, if something didn't make sense, if you want clarification, just email me. I am always happy to take questions online. So let's now talk about the last chapter in our book, globalization and the post-Cold World Order. Boom. So we open, as we sometimes do, with a question. Is there a distinct pattern of order in the post-Cold War period? Is it so different? Is there actually a formal way the world operates? This is a good question. We're gonna look at it. It's a very problematic question because, as we've seen with all the theories we've been talking about, all the different topics we've been talking about, there's really no systematic synthesis of how people approach things. They pick on one part and then they assume. A lot of times incorrectly. That's the most important thing. That's what determines everything. And it's not necessarily the case. As we've seen all of these different perspectives, a lot of them all make good points. We can see an inkling of, truth, if you will, in them, or at least plausibility. So there's no one distinctive way to look at these things, and that's a problem because to look in a globalized world, we have to look at multiple factors. The one big thing that we can definitely say that is distinct in the new pattern of world power is that we have a different expectation in the international order. We have a positive expectation. It used to be negative. How can these states not F everything up and send us to war? That was kind of the expectation. We didn't want them to do anything that negatively influenced things. We wanted a status quo, and that's about it. We now have a positive expectation of the current international order, where we're looking at, well, what can our global regimes, what can all our states do to help people? What can they do to make the world a better place, instead of what can they do to not destroy the world? We're trying to see how our current order actually is trying to benefit people one way or another. And we expect that from things like the UN and all of our NGOs. So a typology of order. These are the ways we're trying to understand how order works. Our ideas about the order of things are being pulled in different competing directions. You have people talking about globalization and how that affects everything. You have how terrorism affects everything. You have how nationalism is still a problem. You have all of these ideas, how culture affects things, how all the different cultures are warring with each other. These are all different ideas that don't necessarily connect. They're all pulling us away, and we have to focus on one, which makes us lose other parts of the picture. So, of course, when we think about order, we need to be thinking about whom that's specifically talking about. Are we talking about states? Are we talking about individuals? Are we talking about groups? Are we talking about peoples? All of this matters, because when you talk about, say, humanitarian law and human rights, you're thinking about individuals mostly, but then also states and how they can change law. So your unit of analysis really depends on how it really affects what you mean when you talk about order. How can we, and of course, how we envision order, how we envision the world to operate, obviously depends on the theoretical framework we exist in. Realists place all the emphasis on the state and then see how stability and balance is managed in military terms. That's how they understand things. That's how they understand order to be kept and how it continues to be kept. Liberalists, of course, look at integration and interdependence and how they become so embedded that they're self-sustaining, that globalization, because of the way our global institutions and our global economy work, essentially is at a point where it just continues itself. There's not going to be this point necessarily where there's a massive hiccup, and it's that these institutions reinforce patterns of globalization. And in time, perhaps, these patterns will lead to potential global governance in a very strong way. We have forms of global governance, as we've talked about, with regimes and institutions trying to steer trade in one direction or another, but it's not super strong yet. There's another line, the third line, where think about this as our Marxists. They're concerned about emancipation. They say, so what about stable states? That's not necessarily the important thing. What about our quality of life? Even if your state is stable, maybe they abuse their peoples. They don't feed them well enough. They still exploit their labor for whatever they need. We need to worry about how we can actually get people to have quality of life and not necessarily about there's a stable order of states. And of course, there's a fourth line who argue that perhaps globalization is our new form of order, that the way the global economy works and global interconnection works, that's actually an order of its own right. That's a good question. So the elements of contemporary order, oh, wow, there's like 8 points here that you should probably make note of because they'll probably be on the test. Good listening question. So let's think about this. Elements of contemporary order. There's the social state system. This is two things about this. States now have this expectation that they should provide social welfare. They're a social service state, that you should be able to provide some sort of affordable health care, welfare to make sure you're poor, don't become desperate. There's this expectations that we live in a state system now that's important, as well as that states are now social with each other. They go to conferences, they go to institutional meetings, and they socialize, they converse, and they adopt norms from each other. This is different. This is not how the world used to operate. People just used to war, and that's how diplomacy was mostly accomplished. This is a new form of order. Of course, we have a massive reliance on identity in the nation state now, as we talked about last chapter, and of course nationalism and culture, that we have to worry about states trying to determine their own identity, and from that they're working from peoples within their borders, worrying about their identity, and what's your state going to look like towards other states. Identity becomes a very important aspect of policymaking and of national interest. Of course, now we have a lot of polarity in the collectivization of security. Cold War, bipolar. There's America and the West, and then the USSR and its allies. Very simple balance. Today, the concept's been complicated a lot. Of course, you have America still mostly the power, but not the superpower. There's a lot of balancing going on, a lot of competing interests, and we have things like NATO and the EU and the AU trying to collectivize security to some point. Also, new elements to the world. Of course, the Organization of Production of Exchange, the global economy, is everywhere. Capitalism is strong. It's taking roots everywhere. Bless you. Policy that affects capitalism affects different nations. There's very much integration with political economy. Of course, now we also have a lot of multilateral agreement and governance. Pretty straightforward. Things like the UN, all of the peace treaties we've talked about, your regimes on nuclear proliferation. All of these things newer, not necessarily the same. We have regionalism. We have states all around the world grouping into regional blocks for trading purposes, for security purposes, for commerce purposes. And does this deny globalization? That's a question some would ask. That perhaps the interconnectedness is just a result of regionalism and regionalization. But it's more than that, because as we'll talk about soon, globalization has long since predated just post the Cold War. We of course now have the liberal rights, the liberal rights order. Essentially, we worry very significantly about human rights now, the importance of this around the world, helping people, trying to make sure that they're okay. This is a continuity with the Cold War. We did worry about that some in the Cold War, if not for ideological purposes such as trying to set up enemies against the communists. But it existed. And of course we have democracy flourishing around the world as well. And then of course we have the North and the South and the two world orders. We could, as we pointed out in one chapter, that perhaps when we think about global trade, we're really thinking about North Atlantic trade. We're thinking about how America, Britain, and Western Europe really just determines everything. And of course that leaves out the global South, leaves out the third world, and how they would like some seat at the table to actually, talk about things. So it creates this tension between the North and the South and the order that we're in. So globalization, the post-Westphalian order, we now have a high degree of economic integration, that banking policy, banking institutions, financial institutions in America and Europe make global differences, how commodities in China are moved here, and trade, and all of these things. Massive amount of economic integration. However, we see that globalization has been going on since prior to the end of the Cold War too. That this was a process that began really mostly following World War II, when we had the creation of the IMF and the World Bank and GATT, and how these set up an economic order to rival communism. They always think about post-World War II as the West setting up things to rival communism, because those were the two conflicting ideologies at that time. So globalization begins its process. We begin really trying to interconnect. We really try to begin with development, developing Africa and South America and Southeast Asia. And they, of course, accept Western institutions, liberalism. They become connected to us with their trade. So we can see that globalization is starting to take root. Soon, parts of the Soviet bloc also start taking this on. Some of their satellite states get minor bits of it. But the Soviet system becomes redundant as time progresses, because they're not competing with us anymore. They are just there. So globalization has now begins to take hold everywhere, because it's not fighting, it's not necessarily rivaling the Soviet system anymore, because they're falling apart. They're not in contrast into anymore. They're just there and they're adopting it. So we then see that globalization is not something unique. It's not sui generis, which is basically unique. It's essentially a binding force between the eras. It's a binding force between Cold War and post-Cold War. That it begins taking root in the Cold War and has followed and expanded since the collapse of it. And this leads to a changing of the game and a changing of the rules of the Westphalian game. That it's not territorial integrity, national identity are now being drastically altered by this massive amount of interconnectedness. States have to adapt their interests to trading with new peoples, to realizing that I'm dependent on America being dependent on China for buying debt for us to continue some of our policies at home. We're all very interconnected, which changes how the classic Westphalian state system set up. And of course, with all this, states have to adapt to it. However, because we see that globalization is very disorderly, it happens differently around the world, it takes root differently around the world, it becomes an inadequate conceptual tool for analyzing the world order, per se. Because it's not, you can't just say, well, this one part makes this different and it makes this happen. There's so many different things going on, it's so varying, it's not even at all, it becomes inadequate in actually analyzing the world order, or at least saying that this is why it happens. Globalization also has effects on legitimacy. We can clearly see there's a very limited effectiveness of democracy on the world scene, if not even in our own countries now, that all of the global interests make essentially representation and accountability very impossible to actually be, in a classic, very democratic way, useful. We elect someone to go to Congress, elect someone to go to the Senate. He only has so much power. He or she only has so much power over the laws being passed, and then, of course, what those laws mean in relation to the global economy. How can we hold him accountable for things? You know, we can, of course, put blame on him, but ultimately, there's only so much power that he has to change things. And of course, he's also accountable to global finances and affected by that. So democracy gets kind of lost in this kind of hazy who's pulling whose strings and who's actually accountable to who, and we lose, you know, a pure version of democracy. And of course, we saw that our world organizations like the WTO and the IMF, the World Bank, you know, they have democratic ideas in them, they have voting systems, but they're still ultimately affected by, you know, the power brokers in the West saying, well, it has to be this way because that's how we say it is. So we can see that in the global picture, democracy is kind of on the sideline. We talk about it and we want it to seem like it's there, but it's not there. Of course, these issues translate to our regional and global bodies. And then, but however, perhaps our accountability is now going to be with the emergence of global civil societies. How we can all come together behind an international organization, say Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and with their lobbying power, with, you know, the energies that we're putting involved and the information they can give out, they can hopefully hold these organizations accountable. That's a bit hazy too, considering that perhaps these groups are also just fronts. They can be considered that there's still so many other interests that aren't being looked at, say, if we're all putting our energies behind one group. Things are still lost, essentially. And then you have the global south in this picture. As we've talked about a lot, the West, America, Europe, holds most of the power worldwide. China and India and Russia, of course, are in that picture. But that still leaves out a lot of other people who aren't represented adequately, or who are at the whims, essentially, of the major powers in the world and what we need. So the global south in this picture, of course, is left looking for resources, either struggling on their own without adopting, you know, Western-led policy, or adopting Western-led policy, but then becoming dependent and hung up on the fact that they now have to listen to the West, and we have some little power over them. So the South, of course, is at the mercy of what's going on in the Western world, and of course, then doesn't really have any legitimate claim to power, so their nations also suffer because of those consequences. So, international order of globalized states. The state is changing. What it means to be in a state is really drastically changing. We're now perhaps in what we could call a globalized state, to where just go to places like Japan, maybe go to New York, go to Times Square, and you can see that global cultures are really swinging into different places. They're dependent on places that aren't necessarily within our own state boundaries. And this makes a difference because the state now has to change interests. They can't just be so self-serving, so nationalistically interested. They have to consider other states. They have to. This is a different thinking about an international order of globalized states. Mind. Right. So if we think about all states being like this, if we're thinking about that most states are now somewhat globalized, they're influenced by all the different cultures, all the different policies of different states, this changes how we think about the international order. It's not necessarily, you know, America balancing against Britain, UK. It's not about America balancing against Russia or China. It's states taking different globalized interests, saying, okay, well, we need to work together a little bit more. We need to take your interest into account too, because we have to worry about things like climate change, global terrorism. These things, all of the globalization effects essentially lead to rethinking the international order because we're more integrated with each other. So this week, we can't necessarily think about globalization as an outside-in development. It's not just this massive unknown force pressing in on states, making them change, you know, making them adopt things they're not familiar with. It's an inside-out approach. It's that States, of course, are developing institutions within them. They're developing their own trade. They're developing their own industry, and that's going out. Other states are buying it. Other peoples are buying it. And how we're becoming interconnected from an outside-in perspective. It's not just this force that's bearing down on everyone. It's this force we're all contributing to. We're all building towards, and it creates integration that way. It's not just some evil force that's bearing down on everything. People are building for it. So the transformation happens within the state, and globalization is an expression of these transformations. It's states looking for outside people to buy product. It's looking for them to buy debt. It's looking for them to open military bases around the world. It's looking for new markets, new forms of labor, so they can, benefit. So it's not just, now of course, it is somewhat outside in when we think about it, because some states have to forcibly adopt those, such as in the South, but even states in the global South, like India, Bangladesh, they still build up their own industries within to accommodate. This idea, this inside-out version of globalization, it's a way to try and to resolve the contradiction between globalization and state interest, which will be talked about now, essentially. So, a really good example of thinking about the outside-in perspective of globalization is the global financial crisis in 2008. It highlights the application of the inside-out thesis on globalization. Interconnectedness around the world brought the economy down, of course. When of course, the mortgage crisis happened here, it spread to Europe in hours, and that spread around the world in hours after that, and the world took a massive downturn very, very quickly because of our institutions being interconnected with each other and all of the different financiers around the world buying into the system. So it happened pretty quickly because of our interconnectedness. However, following this, it wasn't globalization changing things per se. It wasn't, massive global forces like the IMF coming to make things better. It was state intervention. It was state intervention. It was state policy that changed things. It was the U.S. handing out a massive bailout to Wall Street and financial firms. It was other countries around the world doing the same thing for their own countries. So it wasn't just this globalized force making things better. It was states trying to change policy, change conditions with their own state to make things better globally. And we see that's an inside-out perspective, that saving your own industry then spread around the world. It wasn't the world saving your own industry. It was states taking the initiative because they're the ones that had the power to do it. So we can see that there's this false opposition between state power and globalization. A lot of theorists will say that no, globalization is destroying the state, it's destroying state sovereignty, it's making the state weaker. But that's not necessarily the case, because the state, even in the face of a global catastrophe, we're the prime actor who saved things, who made things better. So there doesn't have to be, there isn't this either-or thing. It's not either globalization or a strong state system. You can have both, and that's what the inside-out thesis is trying to do or argue. Of course, when we think about the global financial crisis, we have to think about how was it changed after this, and what it means for globalization. We can see that things haven't changed too drastically. Banking systems still operate somewhat the same way they did prior to the crisis. They're still largely unaccountable. They're still largely given free rein. But we'll have other challenges, of course, that might make us change our economic model. Climate change being probably the most pressing concern. If we continue to operate under the current economic model, which is, exploit the resources you can, make the most money you can, try and strengthen your state, try and strengthen your own system, climate change is going to come, and we're not going to know what to do about it, and it's going to come faster than it needs to. So that offers a challenge to the economic model. If we're going to actively fight climate change, we have to change the global economic model somewhat because currently it's unsustainable in the way it is. And of course, perhaps as globalization continues from the global financial crisis, we'll also see an increase in different perspectives in it, that perhaps the third world is going to actually be involved with talking about how finances should be run, how the global economy should be structured, and perhaps the global financial crisis will lead to that because we saw that Western-led free market Western-led free market capitalism that wasn't hung up on regulation helped dam the world a little bit. So we'll see that perhaps the financial crisis will lead to a rethinking of that idea and give voices with different ideas a greater say. Yes?
So who are you kidding?
Hey man, that's the one thing. We want to be optimistic as much as we can, but as we've read throughout the class many times, that optimism needs to be tempered a little bit. Global Marxism, or Marxism in general, would argue that global capitalism isn't going to change. Why would it change? That doesn't matter, because it's about exploiting profit now. It's the one, I forget if we were talking about it, if I was talking about someone else, just how, the weird thing is that when we think about markets, we think that markets want to make money for as long as they can, in perpetuity, because that means more money, right? If you have more resources, more people being able to buy things, you're just going to make more money in the long term. But for some reason, as we saw in the financial crisis, it wasn't in this class, that's right, because that was the example, they don't care for some reason. Because we watched the video on what kind of led to the crisis in 2007, 2008. Bankers knew about it a couple of years in advance. They knew that what they were doing was essentially Russian roulette. The house of cards was going to collapse eventually. And they chose to keep going because it meant more money now. And they just kept going until it finally just blew up in their face. So while this is rosy, and we can kind of hope maybe we'll think about things differently, as we've seen people who like to make money and who operate under a greed paradigm of that's the way you make money, you need to be as greedy as possible, probably aren't going to change things because really, they're going to be dead the time climate change happens and takes its fullest effects. That sounds like that's your problem, friend. It's your problem. So this is rosy, and hopefully we will change things. Because, hey, the boomers only have like 30 years left, right? Maybe our generation will help change things, but we can still talk about how much neoliberalism affects all the things we do, too, and how we live in a more narcissistic culture now. But that's... We can talk about that sometime if we want to. But so rosy or not, we'll see what happens. So conclusion: we live in the current age of hybridity, where globalization is still globalization's highly impactful. We're interconnected economically, culturally, politically, but we also live in an era where the state is still very strong. Post 9/11. Many states have just renewed their interest in putting themselves forward, protecting national security in the face of globalization. So we live in an era where both of these are still major factors, and they live along each other. Perhaps precariously, perhaps strongly, but they live with each other, and it leads to tension. Of course, ultimately, the essential basis of the world order is political agency of the state. Ultimately, we still live in a state-based system where interstate relations are still very important, and that constructs the state system. If the states put their interest in operating mostly under national security being their primary focus, that's the kind of state system we'll live in. But if they start changing that a little bit to taking global dynamics, climate change, terrorism, things that require cooperation to tackle, that will also change how the state system is. And that's the era we live in, where they're stuck between this very strange place of being very focused on their own national interest while also balancing that kind of state interest where they have to deal with everyone else's as well and adopt their interests. These don't necessarily mesh, and that's why we live in a very interesting, strange time when it comes to international relations. Of course, there's a changing identity of the state. caught between states putting themselves first and states still thinking of themselves first, but first amongst others as well. That we still want to put our national interests first, but we need to take into account China's interest, because if we don't, that could lead to conflict. It could lead to exacerbating climate change or creating tension. We're starting to put state interests in with our own. So our identities as states are changing. So then the international order is essentially in transition right now. We're still dealing with the aftermath of what it means to be a state in the Cold War system and what it means to be a state in this globalized system. And this, we'll see who knows how long this era will last. It could last for a long time. It could, resolve decently quickly, but history will be judged that. And of course, now we have to understand that there's different models of how states behave, and states are states essentially. Think about China. China's a great example of this. China still is technically communist China. They are still the People's Republic of China, but they've integrated capitalism massively. Yeah, they might embrace capitalism a little bit more than we do, in the terms of it makes money. But they're also a state that puts their own interests first. Think about the time I told you that China, in order to inflate their gross domestic product, builds fake. What?
They lower their currency.
They play with their currency, and they build fake cities. They build fake cities that look like New York, that look like Paris, because it shows their construction rates being up. And we know that, when we think about how we look at economic numbers, construction rates really matter with how we determine growth in a nation. So they build fake cities to show they're growing fast.
Are those cities empty?
Yeah, they're completely empty, except maybe like a couple people, and maybe
Will they have to become populated at some time? Like when they say, like, what the hell, dude? Like
no, not necessarily. They're just there because they want to inflate the numbers. They're
there's
not
like
the
all
house
this
people.
homelessness, like in this region of China, but then there's like 10 fake cities over there.
Oh.
There's going to be some kind of exodus.
Not necessarily. Well, think about if we think about China, it's still an authoritarian state, and they know how to keep people in their place. So they're going to want to keep rural poverty where it is instead of having it migrate to a fake city. Because even if they migrate to a fake city, it's still a fake city. It's not like there's like a Starbucks. They're like, well, we're just waiting for the people to come, and when they do, we'll feed them. No, they're still fake cities. But China operates in this very hazy-eyed place of capitalism, communism, interesting model, as well as authoritarianism, as well as inflating the numbers, and as well as really also wanting a global player, but also putting their state interest above everyone else's as well. Mostly because they think the West has done it long enough, so they should be entitled to. An interesting model of how you should run your state. And there's different models all over the world. So we live in this time where there's a lot of difference, and we haven't come to, this great zeitgeist moment of where things resolve. So we'll see what happens, and it will be interesting. And that's the great thing about world politics. It's constantly changing, yet staying the same at the same time. So that's our lesson for today. Remember that next Tuesday, you have homework due, and we're reading the first section of the book, which is, I believe, the prelude, the introduction.
Homework is like these two chapters here.
Huh?
These two chapters here that we talked about today.
No, it's on the first chapter of the new book. The prelude thing. I can't remember what the chapter's called. So, have a good weekend, guys. I'll see you on Tuesday. Thanks for being cooperative during the tape.
Yeah.